Hello and welcome to episode 101 of Linux Dev Time. I'm Joe.
I'm Amalith.
I'm Kevin.
And I'm Andy.
Nice to talk to you all again. Today we're going to talk about GitHub. And once again, you've got a question about it, Andy.
Yeah, so we all do open source free software because we love freedom, because we love free software, we love to see more free software. And yet the kind of central meeting place where a lot of us do our work is a proprietary piece of software now run by a company that a lot of people don't trust. That company is doing a lot of things a lot of people disagree with, and we're locked in. Why are we doing this? There are lots of alternatives. What are we doing?
So there's this thing called the network effect, Andy. Right, well, we'd better get out of here then.
But we've been freeing ourselves, right? So I don't have a Twitter account anymore. I'm having a lot of fun on Mastodon. I'm not locked in anymore to a proprietary piece of software.
Well, I think we should clarify too, there are a bunch of alternatives to GitHub out there. Yes, GitHub is the 300,000-pound gorilla out there, but there are plenty of other platforms out there that do a very similar thing. So I don't think we're disparaging or saying that there's only one.
Absolutely not. I'm saying the opposite. I'm saying there are these alternatives. Why aren't we using them?
Well, also, I would say GitHub was not owned by Microsoft to begin with. Now, it has always been proprietary. Yeah. I don't think they've ever open sourced their core. They have open sourced a bunch of other libraries ancillary to GitHub. But I don't think it's the exact GitHub that we know. The actions didn't exist. Private repos didn't even exist back then, or at least free private repos didn't exist. So there are some changes. And I think we're talking about GitHub as it exists today because it is increasingly moving in a particular direction, while it is also growing. And I would say it has achieved critical mass where more and more people are flocking to it. But we're starting to, and many people do ask these questions like you just did, Andy, as well.
But the reason that everyone is there is because everyone is there. That's just how these things work.
That's true, but we can resist that, right, by making choices. You can move to non-proprietary platforms, you can promote non-proprietary platforms, or you can just think that's someone else's problem. Maybe you might think this isn't a problem, right? But I want to say that I think it is a problem, and therefore it's worth making an effort to resist.
Why is it a problem when, at least for the code aspect of it, it's trivial to mirror that elsewhere?
I actually think that's part of the reason how we got into this mess, right? That with Git, it was clear that you could always get your code out and go somewhere else, and that hadn't been true before with other source control systems.
But that does not include issues and pull requests and all the other social artifacts related to your code base.
Not to mention actions as well.
Right. All of that stuff remains in GitHub, and they do have APIs, and there are bridges for copying new issues from GitHub to SourceHub or whatever.
Oh, I love a bridge. That's definitely going to work well.
Yeah. Well, they do work pretty okay. Issues aren't as complex as chat, I don't think.
See, I think if we're going to talk about lock-in, I'll play the part of the contrarian where I don't necessarily think that we are locked into GitHub by any stretch of the imagination. I think you're correct in saying that issues, discussions, possibly even pull requests, actions for sure, like all of those are things that are GitHub proprietary-ish, yet they're not at all required for your actual repository. And most of them, I would argue, could be replicated in, like, for example, actions is one. You could just have a bunch of shell scripts. You don't have to use actions. Not only that, there is no standard format that we could switch to. Like there is no standard format that they just chose not to use. I'm not aware of any other than, say, shell scripts. So shell scripts possibly is the only shared standard protocol for that type of thing. So I don't necessarily think we're locked in. I think it's just the only choice there. And it's a good one, more or less. And all of the other platforms, be it GitLab, Forgeo, all the other ones, Git, they have similar things as well. And I wouldn't say that if someone used that they would consider themselves locked in. I mean, you can pull all of your data out of the stuff and move it elsewhere. So I think I would be careful about saying locked in. That's my personal opinion, but I'm also willing to be wrong.
I do think we're quite locked in. I think that it's relatively easy to move something like issues to somewhere else and say, I've moved from here to here. I also think it's relatively easy with this type of thing to say, my repository has moved from here to here, right? So we don't have that thing of like losing your name, like on something like Twitter, like losing that Twitter name was like a big thing. I think it's less big. It's still big, but less big with GitHub. But I really think that we are locked in with actions. If you invest a lot of effort into continuous integration builds and your GitHub repository, it is a huge effort to consider to move to a different tool.
Right. And I think I would say that that's the same case for GitLab or 4J or any of the other platforms as well. So the answer could either be just, or Travis CI back in the day, if they're still around, Circle CI, all of these ones have I don't know if I'd call it a proprietary format, but they have their own format, their own YAML files and that run their particular actions. So I don't know that I would say locked in. It's just using that particular platform and moving between them. I've moved between the different CI platforms decently regularly. And it is work for sure, but it's not that much work, especially if you go into using those CI platforms with that sort of mindset of, I'm going to stick to mostly like my CI is going to call my shell scripts, or it's going to call my makefile targets or what have you. Then it's much easier to move between these various platforms.
So I agree with you. If you do that practice, which, by the way, you absolutely should, all of your CI jobs should be kick off this shell script that also runs on my machine, right? Then you're fine. But if you're invested in a lot of the GitHub Actions automation, which GitHub really pushes you towards, then you are really locked in, not just to the way GitHub Actions does stuff, but also to the specific actions that you're using, which, by the way, were uploaded by some internet rando who at any time could change them to steal all your secrets and launch rockets. And other CI systems do not encourage you that way. I think it's a deliberate proprietary software style strategy that has been taken to make GitHub Actions work the way they do, so that you are encouraged to use an action to do something that you could very easily do as like one line of shell script, but instead you check out your code by using a certain GitHub action or these trivial things, which you then end up dependent on. And then, there's lots of downsides to that to do with security, but also lock-in is the big concern we're talking about here.
So I'll concede that point to you. I agree with what you just said. I think the only part where I would start to push back a little bit on is the way that I understand is it's framed more in the sense of GitHub or Microsoft is trying to lock you in. And while they might be, I think some of this is a consequence more of the plugin developers or CI developers. That's really what these things are. They're like plugins for CI. They are trying to make something easier. Like they're trying to abstract away. They're trying to remove boilerplates that you do this one line with this one config file and we kind of do the rest for you. So I think it's more of they're trying to make something useful, and GitHub is also trying to make those things easy to use and reuse, either between your own projects privately or make it available to the world if they want to pull in your own thing. So I think it's more an organic thing that ends up being, I agree, that part of it is pretty lock-in-y.
I will concede that probably the people who wrote these actions or came up with these ideas were not being deliberately malicious, but as a corporation, it really serves Microsoft to make them all lock-in-y like they are. And if you compare it with, for example, GitLab's CI integration, that's mostly shell scripts and Docker, and those are pretty standard.
Are GitHub Actions usable from outside GitHub? Like, could I, in a Forgeo Actions manifest, reference something from GitHub, do you know?
So I don't know that you can directly reference it. There are tools out there, like I believe there's one called Act that will allow you to run your actions locally, more or less. There's some like environment concerns, environment as in like the environment that these things are running in, concerns about the variables that are set up and how exactly they run them. So it's not exactly one for one, but you can do that locally. So there's no reason I guess you couldn't run that somewhere else. What I was going to say though, I think some of this, the actions marketplace, I don't even know if it's called a marketplace, but knowing Microsoft, it probably is called marketplace. I see that more as a thing that was set up, I'm not going to say organically again, but more or less as a reaction to, hey, people are developing different things to share this place, and we need a place to be able to pull it in. GitLab doesn't have that thing. I don't think because they're morally opposed to or ethically opposed to a like lock-in style thing. I think GitLab doesn't have the same critical mass, so I don't think there are people trying to develop and share CI actions between each other. And if there were, maybe they would develop their own proprietary action marketplace, which I think we could then have the same arguments with them as well.
Maybe. And like I say, I shouldn't be trying to suggest people's motives for things like this, right? But the fact is that it does serve a proprietary software company for you to be locked into their stuff, no matter how that comes about. And like computer systems quite often end up with weird corners of proprietary stuff that's very hard to extract yourself from without anyone deliberately doing it, but it still serves people's interests.
Oh, I do agree with that. And I do agree that Microsoft were like, oh, hey, it allows some lock-in. Excellent. We want people to stay more on the platform. I do agree with that. And I will also say that when we're talking about lock-in, I do very much agree that we are socially locked in to GitHub.
Yeah. And to some extent, I feel like that's more GitHub's prerogative, right? Like if you build a really successful code forge, then people will use it and then you'll have inertia. And to some extent, I think that's just fair enough. I wish it wasn't proprietary, and I would like to argue to people, look, let's try and use other things because proprietary software is bad. By the way, I'm pretty sure the GitHub Actions executor is open source. So calling it proprietary is weird, but fundamentally, GitHub itself is proprietary, and they've open sourced enough stuff that makes no difference to anything, and they haven't open sourced the key thing.
I wonder, too, if there's a difference between the various, like some people put up code on GitHub in order for other people to see it. Some people put up code on GitHub or elsewhere and really don't care at all if anyone sees it or not. And I think the people that want other people to see their code randomly, drive-by, pull request, drive-by uses, those people are more socially locked in to GitHub because that's where the eyeballs are. Or the majority of the eyeballs.
Yes, and you've put your finger on why it annoys me so much when people talk about things like how many GitHub stars does my project have? Because you're basically giving your control to Microsoft by doing that.
Are there any other forges that have that same style of metric, whether it be, I don't know, thumbs ups or something, that kind of gamified?
Forgeo and Git do have stars and following users and some social stuff like GitHub, but I know one of SourceHut's stated objectives is explicitly not having any social anything whatsoever.
Which I'm sure definitely appeals to some people, but I wonder too how much that puts them in a more of a niche where if I'm wanting to put my code alongside other people's where it could be randomly seen or used, that may not be the place that I look to first to put my code also.
There is sr.ht/projects where they do expose people's projects in a big list and feature some of them for a period of time. So they have tried to improve discoverability of projects, but not through stars.
I also want to ask the question, how much do people browse GitHub and discover things that way? Surely people find stuff through social media or through something else that they're following, a video or whatever. So actually, as a person who's trying to promote your project, shouldn't you be focusing on getting your Mastodon account, doing interesting stuff so people are following it, so then they find your stuff, rather than just picking the code forge where most people are, which I don't think people browse GitHub, do they?
I don't think they browse, but I think search is pretty heavily used. I've used that pretty heavily myself, looking for Windows 11 debloat PowerShell, right? You know, that'll pop up a ton of references, and as bad or, incorrect as it is, ranking them by GitHub stars at least gives you some metric to start your search, as in like, oh, this one has a lot of stars. I should at least start looking at this one first. Right.
Fair enough. Yeah. So there are alternatives, and SourceHut is a good alternative if you like really old-fashioned, that's not supposed to sound bad, like good old-fashioned ways of doing Git how it should be done. And Codeberg, which is an instance of Forgeo, is like a charitable organization or a not-for-profit organization that is also, has ways of funding itself, so hopefully will stick around. GitLab seems really cool. We've got these alternatives.
There's also a new one called Radical, somewhat new, called Radical, that seems extremely interesting, to me at least. It uses BitTorrent to distribute your project. And it's got some really nice features.
And that's the one also where like issues and everything are stored inside the repo, correct?
Yes, that one does embed the social artifacts in the repo.
Which, by the way, like maybe not the same repo, but like it should absolutely be straightforward to migrate that stuff. The reason I was so attracted to Codeberg is that on the roadmap for Forgeo is federation.
Yes.
So that you can do pull requests from someone else's forge into your forge. And I would love to see that, but unfortunately it's not actually here yet. So it's all pie in the sky.
I've been keeping an eye on, is it Forge Fed, I think, for years.
Right. Yeah, me too.
Radical are also working very heavily on a build system. I have no clue what a distributed build system looks like, or if it will be distributed.
That would be so awesome if you could run your code on like loads of other people's computers, right? If you could somehow do that safely.
Sounds awesome and terrifying at the same time.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by 1Password. In a perfect world, end users would only work on managed devices with IT-approved apps. But every day, employees use personal devices and unapproved apps that aren't protected by MDM, IAM, or any other security tool. There's a giant gap between the security tools we have and the way we actually work. 1Password calls it the Access Trust Gap, and they've also created the first ever solution to fill it. 1Password Extended Access Management secures every sign-in for every app on every device. It includes the password manager you know and love, and the device trust solution you've probably heard of on this podcast back when it was called Collide. 1Password Extended Access Management cares about user experience and privacy, which means it can go places other tools can't, like personal and contractor devices. It ensures that every device is known and healthy, and every login is protected. So stop trying to ban BYOD or shadow IT, and start protecting them with 1Password Extended Access Management. Support the show and check it out at onepassword.com/LinuxDevTime. Quick bit of admin then. First of all, thank you everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. If you want to join those people, you can go to linuxdevtime.com/support. And remember that for various amounts on Patreon, you can get an advert-free RSS feed of either just this show or all the shows in the Late Night Linux family. And you also get quite a lot of episodes a day or so early. And if you want to get in contact with us, you can email show@linuxdevtime.com. It's interesting that at the start of this conversation, you used the term free software, Andy, because you're one of them. You're one of those free software people.
Yeah.
And you've also got your open source people who never use the term free software. And those open source people who never use the term free software just use GitHub, just get on with it and get on with actually writing code and getting it out there and contributing to projects and everything. Whereas your free software people, they're the only ones I ever hear talking about alternatives to GitHub.
And they're the people who've learned the lessons of history that if you don't use licenses that require reciprocity and you're not careful about what services you use, you get stuck, you get people abusing things, it all goes wrong.
I think the hard part is, like it or not, Microsoft dumps a lot of money into GitHub, pays a lot of people to do the boring work, to add all the features that, all the social features that people enjoy. So having another project that can have that level of work done to it is a difficult task. It's a hard task. And also, if a alternative were to gain all of those features, and let's say another alternative that was absolutely free source became the one that everyone went to, how do we keep the same thing from happening to that platform that happened to GitHub? And again, not in a malicious way, just adding new features, trying to have all these things. Like, how do you have a lock-in free, totally open source platform that, doesn't also end up just like another GitHub, just owned by someone else?
When you were talking there, Kevin, I couldn't help but switch GitHub for Windows and the alternatives to Linux.
Yep.
You're basically describing operating systems as well here.
Right. And I would say that in Linux, some of the big 800-pound gorillas there, your now owned by IBM, your Red Hats, that make some questionable decisions as well, especially when it comes to things like lock-in.
Those big companies are cooperating around the Linux ecosystem instead of us being locked into one of their products like we used to be when it was the big Unix vendors or it was Microsoft Windows.
But we could also, just playing devil's advocate here, talk about there being tens, hundreds of different distributions where people's eyeballs and attentions are split between all of those. So we can't have the one massive, the Windows or whatever it be, right?
So the model I would like us to have is more like the Fediverse, right? Like where there's lots of competing software that can all talk to each other. But I would actually take, if GitHub was completely open source and it could be kind of community controlled and not like be farmed for AI, whatever, then I would live with that. That's, for me, that's like Linux. There's only one thing and it's got all kinds of weird corners, but that's okay because everyone uses it, right? And everyone cooperates on it.
I'll say this tongue in cheek, but could not the Git core not be the Linux kernel that is then wrapped in all of these other GitHub, GitLab, 4JO, Git things out there?
Yeah, if all of the Linux distributions were totally proprietary, yeah, but they're not.
It always comes back to the network effect, though. And I don't think there's a lot we can do about that, is there? Like, yeah, you've said it'd be great if it was federated and everything, but people are still using Twitter, quite a lot of them. I wouldn't do it myself, but people are still using it. And people will just use the name they know. And if all of the software is on GitHub, then you kind of have to be there, much like how all the episodes of the Late Night Linux family shows are on YouTube, just with a visualizer and just kind of dumped there as an afterthought. But you have to be on YouTube because that's where everything is. You have to be on Spotify because that's where everything is. We'd prefer it if people used AntennaPod or some other open source free software podcast app. But you have to meet people where they are, and the people are on GitHub.
And that's why my project Willow is on GitHub. But I also have and list options for SourceHut and Codeberg and Radical. That's a lot. I'm probably going to regret that.
Yeah, good luck trying to manage pull requests from all of them and issues from all of them.
Right now, there are 0 pull requests and 0 issues on all. Well, there are tons of issues on SourceHut, but they're all my issues. So right now, it's okay.
So long as you turn off issues and pull requests on all of them but one and point them all to that one, I guess, then that's an easier way to manage that. And, I think we were talking about earlier with the social aspect and federating of the various different Git forges. The one thing, I really hope that they can tackle the account piece of it. Because that's I have my own Git T instance. I don't use it that often. It's a mirror for a bunch of other things. But with that, having somebody have to create a login just to view my stuff there, or, my repositories on GitLab or my repositories on GitHub. GitHub is easy because most people have that account. But if we had all these little instances that were federated everywhere, we definitely have to solve that login issue. Otherwise, I think that's a whole new level of difficult.
But yeah, I think federation does solve that, right? By just saying you have a login to your server and then you can interact with other servers. I don't want to tell people what they should do with their project, right? If your project needs the social interaction that you get from GitHub, then you've got to put it on GitHub. I'm not arguing with that. What I'm saying is think about it. And think about why you want the world to go. I started using Linux when it was pretty painful because I wanted the world to go that way. The world, despite your smirk, Joe, the world has gone that way. I am now absolutely able to use Linux. I use it for my work all the time.
I'm not smirking because of that. I'm smirking because you're just saying be the change you wish to see in the world.
Be the change you wish to see in the world. And make the choices you can, right? So, for example, for my programming videos, I put them on a PeerTube server. I promote that PeerTube server. But I also put them on YouTube.
Where you get 10 times as many views.
Where I get 10 times as many views, but the option is there and the promotion that I'm doing is of the free alternative.
I like something you said too at the beginning about just being mindful of the ways in which you could be getting locked in and make those decisions knowingly. If you're going to use a GitHub action from the marketplace, that's okay if that's what your project is, and it's everyone's individual choice, but just be mindful of it because sometimes you might think oh, actually I could just do this in a shell script really quickly and shell out to that, and now you can move it anywhere. So I really like that part of it, just being intentional.
I feel like that's the best thing we've said all through this episode is if you're going to do CI, just make it a script that you can run on your machine.
Yeah, or just build it all in AWS and just suck up the massive bill. It'll be fine.
At least until we get this distributed AI build that runs on everybody else's computers.
It uses an LLM to figure out whose computers to run what on.
Yeah, what could go wrong? Well, we better get out of here then. We'll be back in a couple of weeks, but until then, I've been Joe.
I've been Amalith.
I've been Kevin.
And I've been Andy.
See you later.